I have been asked to give this deposition once, I will give it once. After today I will not speak of the Vethari petition again, and I will ask that the Assembly seal my testimony alongside the petition, records themselves in the same vault, under the same designation tier, with the same prohibition on access that the Vethari continuance placed on their own copies before the continuance dissolved. I am not making this request because I am frightened, though I am frightened. I am making it because the account you are about to hear is the kind that does not improve with repetition. It does not clarify. It does not acquire context. It sits in the mind of the person who holds it and grows heavier every year, and the only mercy I have found is to speak it rarely. And to speak it only when the alternative is watching someone else walk into the same corridor. The Orveth Assembly is, I understand, currently considering whether to submit a formal transit petition of its own. I understand the reasoning. The Heathseth corridor is congested. The alternative routing adds 42 days to every supply run between the outer systems and the Orveth core. 42 days is not nothing. 42 days, compounded across the volume of traffic that moves through those lanes, becomes a number that administrative offices, notice and navigation councils argue about, and logistics directors use to justify proposals that other people should have refused before the proposals were ever written. I understand all of that. I processed the Vethari version of that same calculation in a building that no longer stands, on behalf of a continuance that no longer exists. I understand it completely. The corridor in question, the one the Orveth Assembly is looking at, is the Sorveth Passage, designated in the Outer Survey Register as Approach Corridor 7 of the Oreth-Vayan boundary. Oreth-Vayan is the current galactic designation for what the Vethari called the Vethari Passage when they first mapped it, and what every species with a star atlas has called, in their own language, by some variation of the same phrase. The phrase translates differently depending on the species, but the meaning is consistent. Do not enter without permission. The older atlases, the ones produced by the Sethavari, the Drassic, the early Etheri surveys, do not even include a recommended permission process. They simply mark the boundary and note that the sector beyond it carries no navigational guarantee, no guarantee of safe passage, no guarantee of communication, no guarantee of response. The Vethari found that language inadequate. They were a practical species. Practical species find vague warnings inadequate. They wanted specific conditions. They wanted to know what the guarantee threshold was. They wanted to know whether a sufficiently compliant, sufficiently documented, sufficiently well-announced petition would be received in good faith and answered with specific transit terms. They wanted to know whether Oreth-Vayan was a bureaucratic restriction, something that could be navigated through the right channels, or something else. I was at the time a mid-rank classification officer in the Vethari Bureau of Outer Approaches. My designation was Outer Correspondence Analyst, 3rd tier, which meant that I processed income and outgoing communications for approaches to designated restricted zones. Most of my work was routine. Species filed petitions. We cross-referenced them against the relevant zone authorities. Zone authorities responded, or did not respond, within standard waiting periods. We logged the responses, updated the designation records, and forwarded the outcomes to the logistics councils that had initiated the petitions. This was not complicated work. It was the kind of work that fills offices and is forgotten almost immediately by the people who requested it. Vethari petition to Oreth-Vayan was not routine. I knew it was not routine from the moment the continuance's Senior Navigation Council submitted processing. The petition was in its physical form exactly what every other petition was: a formatted request document, a route specification, a proposed transit schedule, a statement of cargo composition and vessel classification, a diplomatic summary establishing the Vethari continuance's credentials and peaceful intent. The formatting was correct. The documentation was complete. There was nothing unusual about the paperwork itself. What was unusual was the address. Most restricted zone petitions go to a zone authority. The zone authority is an administrative body, a species, a council, a bureau, a governing organization of some kind that maintains jurisdiction over the restricted space and processes requests for access. The zone authority reviews the petition, applies its criteria, and issues a response. Approval, conditional approval, denial, referral to a higher authority. This is the standard process. It has been the standard process for as long as the outer designation system has existed. Oreth Vayan did not have a listed zone authority in the standard format. The designation record carried a communication protocol. The protocol did not list an administrative body. It listed a transmission frequency, a signal format specification, and a receiving designation. Receiving designation was not a species name. It was not a council name. It was not an organizational identifier of any kind that I could cross-reference in the outer registry. It was a designation string, a long sequence of formatted characters that, when I ran it through the classification index, returned a single result. The result was a self-referential entry. The designation string pointed back to Oreth Vayan itself. I flagged this in my processing notes. I noted that the zone authority entry appeared to be self-referential, and that I was uncertain how to address the petition, given that the standard process required an identifiable recipient. I submitted my notes to my supervising officer, a senior analyst named Devith Sorn, who had processed outer approaches for 30 years, and who reviewed my notes with the kind of careful attention that 30 years of routine work produces in people who have never encountered something that is not routine. Devith Sorn told me that self-referential designation entries were not unknown in the outer registry. They occurred when a zone's authority structure had changed, when the species or body that originally maintained the designation had dissolved, moved, or merged, and the entry had not been updated to reflect the change. He told me that in these cases the correct procedure was to transmit the petition to the listed frequency, using the listed signal format, and to wait the standard response period. If no response was received within the standard period, petition would be logged as no contact and referred to the Logistics Council with a recommendation to seek an alternative route. I asked how long the standard response period was for Oreth Vayan. He checked the designation record. The record listed no standard response period. It listed a notation in the protocol section that read, in the archival translation, from whatever language had originally entered it. Acknowledgement of receipt will be transmitted upon processing. Estimated processing time. Variable. I asked what variable meant in this context. Devith Sorn said it meant that we should transmit the petition and wait. We transmitted the petition on the 43rd day of the third interval of the year the Vethari Navigation Council had designated as the year of the for outer approaches, which was not a name that anyone outside the Vethari continuance used, which I record here because it is the year I mean, and I want to be precise. The transmission was sent using the specified frequency and signal format. I logged the transmission time, the transmission content, the signal integrity on departure, and the name of the technician who executed the send. I filed the log in the Outer Correspondence Archive under the petition's reference number, which was Outer Approach Reference 19-4-Aurath, and I moved on to processing the other petitions that were waiting on my desk. 17 days later, the acknowledgement arrived. This was not in itself unusual. 17 days was within the range of normal response times for outer designation contacts. What was unusual, what I noticed when I opened the acknowledgement and began reviewing it against the petition format, was the timestamp. The acknowledgement carried a transmission timestamp. This is standard. Every transmission in the outer correspondence system carries a timestamp indicating when it was sent. The timestamp on the acknowledgement from Oreth Vayan indicated that the acknowledgement had been transmitted 11 days before we sent the petition. I read the timestamp 3 times. I checked it against the system clock. I checked it against the archive log of our transmission. The numbers were consistent with each other and inconsistent with any ordinary explanation. The acknowledgement had been sent 11 days before the petition existed. I took the acknowledgement to Devith Sorn. He read it. He read the timestamp. He read it again. Then he set it on his desk, and he was quiet for a long time. And when he finally spoke, he said, "Log it as received. Reference the timestamp as anomalous, and submit it to the Senior Bureau Director for review." I asked whether we should halt processing pending the review. He said, "Log it as received." I logged it as received. The content of the acknowledgement was, in the body text, exactly what an acknowledgement should be. It confirmed receipt of the petition. It confirmed that processing was underway. It provided a reference number for the acknowledgement, a number that, when I ran it through the outer registry cross-reference, returned the same self-referential result as the zone authority entry. It noted that transit conditions would be transmitted upon completion of processing, and that the petitioning party should refrain from entering the designated corridor until conditions had been received and confirmed. The language was formal, correct, and entirely standard. Except for the timestamp. The bureau director reviewed the acknowledgement. She convened a small working group, 3 senior analysts, a signals technician, and a representative from the Navigation Council that had initiated the petition. The working group examined the timestamp for 9 days. They checked the transmission logs. They checked the signal propagation records. They checked whether there was any technical explanation, any pre-transmission signal artifact, any clock synchronization anomaly, any archiving error that could account for the 11-day discrepancy. They found none. The working group's final assessment, I read. Because I was the correspondence analyst assigned to the petition, and the assessment was circulated to everyone in the processing chain, concluded that the timestamp discrepancy could not be explained by any known technical failure. The assessment recommended that the bureau director escalate the matter to the Continuances Outer Affairs Directorate and request a decision on whether to proceed with the petition or withdraw it. The assessment noted that the acknowledgement's content was otherwise compliant with standard correspondence protocols, and that the transit conditions had not yet been received, and that no further anomalous communications had been logged. The Outer Affairs Directorate deliberated for 22 days. I want to be honest about what those 22 days were like, because this is a deposition and honesty is the point. Those 22 days were quiet. The anomalous acknowledgement sat in the archive under its reference number. The petition sat in the pending file. The signals technician ran a second check on the transmission logs and found the same results as the first check. People in the bureau went about their other work. I processed 3 other petitions that month. 2 routine approaches to survey restricted zones. 1 referral from a neighboring species navigation office that had submitted a petition using the wrong signal format and needed to resubmit. None of these was notable. The office was quiet. The anomaly was contained in its file, and the file was on a shelf, and the shelf was in a building where people came and went and ate their midday meals and complained about the heating system and argued about minor administrative questions that seem, in retrospect, very far away. What I mean when I say the 22 days were quiet is that the Bureau's surface, quiet. What was happening underneath the surface was something I can only describe as a slow recognition, the kind that does not announce itself and does not arrive all at once, but that settles into a person incrementally, like a temperature change in a room. You are not sure when you became aware of it, only that at some point you are aware of it entirely. The anomaly was in the file and the file was on the shelf, and I knew what the anomaly meant, or I knew enough of what it meant to know that I had never encountered anything like it, and that the working group's technical review was not going to produce an explanation that made it ordinary, because there was no ordinary explanation for a reply that arrives before the letter is written. The laws that govern correspondence, the laws that govern all correspondence, in every system I had ever worked in every format I had ever used, have as their most basic assumption the sequence of transmission and receipt. You send, the recipient receives. Time moves in one direction. The receipt does not precede the transmission. If it does, you are no longer in the domain of correspondence. You are in a different domain, one for which my profession had no procedures, no precedents, and no category. I ate my midday meals. I processed my routine filings. I argued a minor point about formatting standards with the analyst at the desk adjacent to mine, a point which neither of us can have cared about, and which I cannot now remember. And underneath all of this I was aware, every day of those 22 days, that there was a shelf in our archive room that held a file that had been responded to before it was sent, and that whoever or whatever had sent that response was still presumably at the other end of the contact frequency, and that at some point, the directorate would make a decision about what to do next. The transit conditions arrived on the 41st day after the acknowledgement. The conditions document was longer than I had expected. Most transit conditions for outer designation corridors are brief: a list of permitted vessel classes, a schedule of approved transit windows, a set of communication protocols for in-transit contact with the zone authority, and a statement of prohibited activities. The Orth Vayan conditions document was 47 pages in the standard formatting. I read all 47 pages. It was my job to read it. It was also, and I want to be honest about this too, something I could not stop reading once I had started, because the document was the most coherent, and the most specific, and the most deeply wrong thing I had ever read in my professional life. The conditions were not arbitrary. That was the first thing I noticed. Every condition in the document was specific, reasoned, proportionate to an identifiable concern. The vessel class restrictions made navigational sense for the corridor geometry. The transit window schedule was calibrated to an interval pattern that I recognized when I checked the relevant survey records as corresponding to a repeating measurement cycle in the Orth Vayan sector's outer boundary, a cycle that had been logged by the Sethavari and the Jurassic surveyors and was noted in the outer registry as a passive observation artifact with no identified source. The communication protocols were precise and technical and used a signal specification that I had never seen in any standard format, but which, when I compared it against the archived transmission records from our petition exchange, was the same specification that had been used in the acknowledgement. The conditions had been written by something that knew the corridor, not abstractly, not in the way that a governing body knows a zone it administers from a distance, in the way that something knows a space it occupies continuously and completely, and has occupied for long enough to have catalogued every variable. The 43rd page contained the section I want the Assembly to understand, because it is the section that the Vethari Outer Affairs Directorate read, and it is the section that, I was told later, by people who had been in the room, the Directorate read in complete silence without speaking for a very long time. The section was titled, in the document's own language, Passage and Return. The section explained that the conditions for passage through the corridor were binding on all vessels in the transit convoy. That compliance with the conditions was not optional and was not subject to individual vessel discretion. That the conditions had been designed to permit safe transit for vessels of the specified class, operating within the specified windows, carrying the specified cargo composition, maintaining the specified communication protocols, that vessels, operating in compliance with all conditions, would complete transit and emerge from the far boundary of the corridor intact. Then, the section explained what would happen to vessels that did not comply. It did not use threatening language. I want to be precise about that, because the Assembly may imagine that the document read as a warning or as a deterrent, that it had the register of an ultimatum, of something designed to frighten. It did not. The section read the way a technical specification reads: cause and effect, operating condition and system response. If a vessel deviated from the communication protocol by more than the specified tolerance, the section explained, the vessel would be detected as non-compliant. Detection of non-compliance would initiate a response from the corridor's monitoring infrastructure. The monitoring infrastructure was described in 4 pages of technical detail that I am not qualified to summarize accurately, but which the signals technician on the working group later described to me as comprehensive in a way that suggested whoever wrote it had designed the infrastructure themselves. The response to non-compliance was described in 1 sentence. The sentence read, non-compliant vessels will be processed. That was the complete sentence. Non-compliant vessels will be processed. The section offered no further elaboration, no description of what processing entailed, no timeline, no outcome. Just the verb in the passive voice, with no identified subject, processed. By what, by whom, the sentence did not say. It did not need to say. 42 pages of conditions that preceded it had established, with complete technical specificity, that the thing writing those conditions understood the corridor, and everything in it, in a degree of detail that made the unelaborated verb sufficient. You did not need to know what processed meant to understand what it meant. The Outer Affairs Directorate voted to withdraw the petition. They voted to withdraw it quietly and completely. Without public announcement, without referral to the Navigation Council for appeal, and without submitting any formal communication to the Orath Vayan contact frequency to notify the zone of the withdrawal. That last decision, the decision not to send a withdrawal notification, was the one I argued against. Not forcefully, not at any length. I raised it once, in a brief written comment appended to the withdrawal memorandum, noting that standard courtesy protocol for outer designation approaches recommended a withdrawal notification to the zone authority when a petition was being withdrawn after acknowledgement had been received. The Directorate's response to my comment was a single line. It read, "Standard courtesy protocol applies to zone authorities whose response timeline is consistent with standard correspondence norms." I did not argue further. The petition was withdrawn. The file was closed. The designation record for Orath Vayan was updated with a notation in the approach history section. Petition submitted, acknowledged, conditions received, petition withdrawn by petitioning party. The notation did not include a reason for withdrawal. It did not describe the timestamp anomaly. It did not summarize the conditions document or quote the processing sentence. It was a clean notation, the kind that sits in an archive and tells future researchers that something happened without telling them what it was. This was 11 years before the Vethari Navigation Council submitted the second petition. I was no longer a third-tier analyst by then. I had been promoted twice, largely on the basis of administrative competence and the absence of any notable errors, and I was by then a senior correspondence officer, with my own staff and my own queue of outer approach filings. I learned about the second petition the way I learned about most things in the Bureau, through the circulation of internal memoranda, and when the memorandum arrived in my queue, I read it with the kind of attention that made my hands stop what they were doing and stay still on the desk until I had read it 3 times. The second petition had been initiated by a different branch of the Vethari Navigation Council, not the Outer Approaches Division that had filed the first petition, but the Commercial Transit Authority, which was a separate body with its own staff and its own archive and its own institutional memory. The Commercial Transit Authority had, in its own archive, a record of the Hesith Corridor Congestion Study. It had the routing analysis that showed Orath Vayan as a viable alternative corridor. It had correspondence with the Outer Approaches Division, indicating that the division had previously investigated Orath Vayan and found the approach unfeasible, for reasons that were logged in the division's internal records. What the Commercial Transit Authority did not have, what had apparently not been shared between the two bodies, reasons that I could not determine, and that I suspect were largely bureaucratic in nature, the kind of failure of communication that happens between adjacent offices that rarely have cause to exchange their files directly, was the conditions document. They had known that the first petition had been withdrawn. They had not known why. They filed the second petition before I could reach anyone senior enough to stop them. I sent a memorandum to the Director of the Outer Affairs Directorate within the same day that I read the circulation notice. I sent a second memorandum to the Commercial Transit Authority's Director, flagging that a previous petition had been withdrawn and requesting an immediate hold on the second filing pending a review of the first petition's boards. I sent a third memorandum to my own director requesting authorization to escalate. I was thorough and I was fast, and I was, I believe, entirely within the scope of my professional obligations in doing all of this. By the time the holds and escalations and review requests had been assembled into a coherent administrative response, the second petition had already been transmitted. The acknowledgement arrived 9 days later. The timestamp on the second acknowledgement was 18 days before the petition was sent. The Outer Affairs Directorate did not convene a working group this time. The director read the acknowledgement and the timestamp and called a closed session with the 3 most senior members of the directorate. And then the director sent a private communication asking me to come to her office and bring the original conditions document from the first petition's file. I brought it. We sat in her office, the director, the 3 senior members, and I, and we read the conditions document again. together. And when we reached the passage and return section, the director said, "We are going to withdraw the second petition." I said, "We may not be able to withdraw it in the ordinary way," she said. "Why?" I said. "Because the acknowledgement timestamp tells us that whatever is at the other end of the contact frequency received the petition before we sent it, which means it may have already begun processing it, which means a withdrawal notification may not arrive before processing is complete, whatever processing means." The director was quiet for a long time. Then she says, "Send the withdrawal notification anyway." We sent it. I do not know whether the withdrawal notification was received before processing was complete, because I do not know what processing means, and I do not know what complete means in the context of whatever system is administering Orath Vayan. What I know is what happened to the convoy. The second petition had included a transit schedule. The Commercial Transit Authority, seating with the filing while the administrative holds were still being assembled, had attached a proposed convoy composition: 8 vessels, 4 cargo carriers, and 4 support ships, a reasonable transit complement for a corridor evaluation run. The convoy had been assembled in anticipation of petition approval. It was staged in the outer approaches, waiting. When the withdrawal notification went out, a copy went to the convoy staging authority as a matter of protocol. The convoy was stood down. The vessels were reassigned to their standard routes. This happened within 6 days of the withdrawal notification's transmission, and, as far as I could determine from the records, every vessel in the convoy received the stand-down order and complied with it. One vessel did not respond to the stand-down confirmation request. The vessel was a cargo carrier, the 4th in the convoy list, a mid-weight transport called the Vethori Nas, under the command of a navigation officer whose name I will not record here because his family deserves whatever peace the absence of his name from official documents can provide. The Vethori Nas had departed from its staging position 3 days before the stand-down order was issued. Its departure had been logged by the staging authority as unauthorized, the kind of log entry that gets made when a vessel leaves without clearance, and someone has to write something in the departure record. The staging authority assumed it had gone to a fuel depot or a maintenance stop. These things happened. They were irregular but not alarming. The Vethori Nas was found 41 days later at the outer boundary of the Heseth corridor on the far side of Orath Vayan from where it had departed. It was intact, no structural damage, no hull breach, all systems nominal. The cargo was undisturbed. The fuel reserves were at the level you would expect after a transit of the corridor's estimated length. Crew of 11 was aboard. I read the medical assessment cement report. I am not going to describe it in detail, because the detail is not what matters, and because the medical officers who wrote it had the clinical precision of people who are putting language to something they do not fully understand, and their precision produces a document that is accurate and terrible in equal measure. What I will say is this: the crew was alive and uninjured, and the standard medical indicators, the ones that tell you whether a person has been in vacuum or exposed to radiation or subjected to acceleration forces beyond their tolerance, were all within normal range. They were physically intact. They did not speak, not initially. Not for the first 4 days after the rescue vessel reached them. They moved when directed. They ate when food was placed in front of them. They responded to questions with appropriate motor responses, nodding, turning, making eye contact, but produced no language, no verbal communication, no written communication when offered a writing instrument. The senior medical officer noted in the report that the crew appeared to be in a state of profound and uniform psychological withdrawal, and that the withdrawal did not correspond to any standard trauma presentation she had encountered. Because standard trauma presentations are specific, they respond to the specific thing that caused them, whereas this withdrawal appeared to be complete, as if the crew had encountered something that had filled every category of response entirely and left no remainder. On the 5th day, the navigation officer in command of the Vethori Nas spoke. He spoke for 7 minutes. A recording was made. Again, was sealed by order of the Outer Affairs Directorate and placed in the same vault as the conditions document and the petition files. I listened to the recording once, in the director's office, with the door closed. I am not going to transcribe it here. For the same reason, I will not quote the passage and return section verbatim. Not because the assembly doesn't have the right to know what it said, because I have found, in the years since, that the thing which makes those 7 minutes stay with a person is not the specific content of what was said. It is the register of the voice saying it. The content is describable. The register is not. I have tried over the years to find language for the register, because it is the thing that anyone who has heard the recording remembers, and it is the thing I want the assembly to understand. And the closest I have come is this. It was the voice of a person who had completed something, not survived it, not escaped it, completed it the way a calculation is completed, a process that was entered into with a set of inputs and that produced, at its terminus, a result. The navigation officer's voice was the voice of someone at the terminus, not frightened, not relieved, not traumatized in any way that I had encountered before, just completed, finished with something that was finished with him. The result was in place. There was nothing left to be uncertain about. I found this more difficult to hear than I had expected. I had expected testimony. I had expected an account shaped by experience and emotion and the effort to communicate what had happened. What I heard was something that had moved past experience into something quieter and more permanent, and the permanence of it was what stayed with me when I left the director's office, and what has stayed with me since. It is the register of a person who has seen something that has no category in their existing understanding, and who has spent 4 days trying to fit it into a category and failed, and has now decided that the only honest thing to do is to describe it without a category, in the plainest language available, as accurately as possible, with no attempt to make it make sense. He described the transit. He described entering the corridor. He described the communication protocols. The Vethori Nas, which had departed before the stand-down order, had been in possession of the conditions document as part of the convoy briefing materials, and the navigation officer had followed the protocol specifications precisely, he said, because the specifications were clear. And because he was a careful officer and because the corridor, once entered, did not feel like a place where imprecision would be tolerated. He said that corridor did not feel like a place where imprecision would be tolerated. He used those words. He had been following the protocols for 17 hours when the Vethori Nas received a direct communication. The communication was on the specified frequency. It used the specified signal format. It was technically within the parameters of the approved communication protocol. It was also, he said, the first time in 17 hours of transit that anything had communicated with them. And it was also the first time, he said, that he had understood fully what the conditions document had meant when it said that the monitoring infrastructure was comprehensive. Because the communication addressed the Vethori Nas by name, not by registration number, not by vessel class designation, not by the convoy reference number that had been assigned to it in the petition filing, by name. The name it had been given by the yard that built it, 23 years before the transit, by workers who had no connection to Orith Vayan, and no reason to expect that the name would ever reach whatever was receiving it. By name, in the same signal format that the conditions document specified, through the same frequency, with a timestamp that, and here the navigation officer paused for a long time in the recording. Long enough that I thought the recording had reached its end before it had. With a timestamp that predated the Vethori Nas's departure from the staging area by 6 days. The communication informed the Vethori Nas that the petition associated with its convoy had been withdrawn, and that transit through the corridor was therefore no longer authorized, and that the vessel should proceed to the far boundary of the corridor by the most direct route and depart at the specified exit point, and that it should not deviate from this route, and that it should maintain the communication protocol for the remainder of the transit. The navigation officer followed these instructions. He said that the transit from the point of the communication to the far boundary took approximately 31 hours. He said that for the entirety of those 31 hours, the vessel moved through the corridor in silence, except for the required protocol transmissions, which he made on schedule, and which were acknowledged on schedule, and that at no point during those 31 hours Did he or any member of his see anything? No other vessels, no infrastructure, no visible source for the communication they had received, or for the acknowledgments they receiving. The corridor was, to all optical and sensor observation, empty. He said that empty was the wrong word, and then he stopped. And then he said, the corridor was not empty. He said, I have been trying for 4 days to find the right word for what the corridor was. And the right word is attended. The corridor was attended by something that did not show itself, but that was present in every part of it. In the way that a room is attended by the person sitting in the corner you are not looking at. You do not see them. You know they are there. The knowing is not a fear response. It is a certainty. It is the kind of certainty that makes fear beside the point, because fear is what you feel when the outcome is uncertain, and in that corridor the outcome was not uncertain. We were going to reach the far boundary and exit. We were going to do this because we had been told to, and because we had complied, and because whatever was attending the corridor had made it clear, not in words but in the 31 hours of that transit, in the quality of the silence and the precision of the acknowledgments, and the fact that the vessel was intact, and the crew was intact, and the cargo was intact, that compliance was the variable that determined outcomes, and that we had met the variable. He said, I do not know what happens to vessels that do not meet it. He said, I know that I did not want to find out, and I know that whatever is in that corridor knew that I knew. And I know that whatever is in that corridor has known everything about every vessel that has ever entered it before those vessels entered. The timestamp on the acknowledgement is not an anomaly. It is a description of normal operating conditions. The thing in that corridor does not respond to petitions. It processes them. It has processed every petition ever filed for transit through that space, and it processed ours. The fact that we received a withdrawal notification means that the petition authority we belong to had the sense to withdraw before the convoy departed, and the fact that the Vithori Nas departed before the withdrawal arrived means that I am sitting here telling you this, instead of being an entry in the empty set record that every species with a star atlas keeps for the approaches that do not return. He said, do not file a third petition. Then he stopped speaking. He did not speak again during the remaining recovery period. The medical report noted that his physical condition remained stable. The report noted that the rest of the crew's condition also remained stable. It noted that none of the 11 crew members returned to active navigation service, and that 3 of them submitted formal requests to be moved from the outer approaches duty classification entirely. The report's final section recommended a psychological follow-up program, and I was told later that the program was initiated, and I was not told what it found, because by that time the Outer Affairs Directorate had sealed the records, and I was no longer in the processing chain. The Vethari Outer Affairs Directorate filed no third petition. What they did file, in the years that followed, was a series of navigational notices to neighboring species navigation offices. The notices did not describe the conditions document. They did not describe the timestamp anomalies. They did not describe the 7 minutes of the navigation officer's recording. They described only the routing, the fact that Orith Vaughan was not a viable transit corridor, and recommended alternative routes. The notices were professional and dry, and contained no information that would cause anyone to take them seriously as anything more than a routing advisory, which is exactly what they were designed to appear to be, and which is exactly, I have come to believe, why they failed. Because the Vitharif Navigation Congress, 12 years after the second petition, began discussing a third. I learned about this from a colleague in the Outer Approaches Division who had also been present for parts of the second petition's processing and felt, as I did, that the Congress did not fully understand what it was discussing. We submitted a joint recommendation. We cited the conditions document. We cited the timestamp record. We cited the navigation officer's 7-minute deposition, which was sealed but whose existence we could reference without quoting. The recommendation was received. It was reviewed. It was sent to the Congress's Technical Advisory Board, which examined it and produced a response that said, in substance, that the previous petition suffered from administrative failures that a properly managed third petition would avoid, and that the corridor's economic importance had increased sufficiently since the second petition that the routing advisory could no longer be treated as a permanent prohibition. My colleague and I requested a meeting with the Congress. We were given one. We went to it prepared. We brought everything we could bring without violating the seal on the classified records. The routing analytics, the acknowledgement timestamp records, the withdrawal notification log, the staging authority's departure log for the Vethori NAS, the medical report's executive summary. We laid it out. We explained it. We sat across from 12 members of the Vethori Navigation Congress, and we explained what the timestamp anomaly indicated about the nature of whatever was administering Orathvayan, and what the conditions document indicated about the degree to which it monitored the corridor, and what the navigation officer's account of his transit indicated about the experience of passing through a space that is attended by something that has already processed your petition before you submitted it. The Congress listened. Then the Congress chair asked, "Was the first convoy harmed?" We said the first convoy was never sent. He said, "Was the Vethori NAS harmed?" We said, "The crew of the Vethori NAS was returned intact, but was not subsequently fit for outer navigation service, and some members were not subsequently fit. Active duty of any kind, which we considered a form of harm, though we acknowledged it was not physical harm in the conventional sense." She said, "So, a compliance and properly executed returns vessels intact," we said. Based on the evidence of one transit, yes. The conditions of that transit included a withdrawal notification that the vessel received before the stand-down reached it, and the withdrawal notification is the reason the vessel was directed to the exit boundary rather than. We paused here, and we said the word, rather than processed. She said the new petition would be fully compliant. The new convoy would be properly briefed on the conditions. No vessel would depart before the approval was confirmed. We said, "The acknowledgement timestamp tells you that the zone receives the petition before you send it. This means the zone's processing timeline is not synchronized with yours. A vessel that departs after the approval is confirmed in your timeline may still depart before the zone has processed the approval in its own timeline. We don't know enough about the nature of the zone's temporal processing to guarantee the sequence." The Congress chair looked at us for a moment. Then she said, "That is a theoretical concern. Practical experience of the Vethori NAS is that the zone processed the withdrawal correctly and returned the vessel intact. Practical experience is the basis for navigation decisions," my colleagues said, with respect. The navigation officer's account is not primarily a practical account. It is a phenomenological account. He described 31 hours in a corridor attended by something that knew the vessel by name before it entered and knew the petition timeline before the petition existed. The practical outcome of that transit was intact return. The practical account of that transit is that compliance was the variable. We don't know all the conditions under which compliance holds. The Congress chair said, "Thank you for your recommendation. We will take it under advisement." The meeting ended. The Vethori Navigation Congress submitted the third petition 4 months later. I resigned my position in the Outer Approaches Bureau the day I learned about the third petition submission. True. Not because resignation would change anything. The petition had already been transmitted. But because I had been in the Bureau for 19 years, and I had given the Congress everything I had that was available to give, and the Congress had taken it under advisement, and I could not continue to process outer approach filings with my name in the correspondence chain while the third petition was in the system. I want to be honest about the resignation too, because this is a deposition, and the internal facts are as relevant as the external ones. I did not resign in anger. I did not resign as a protest. I resigned because the morning I read the memorandum about the third petition submission, I sat at my desk for a long time without doing anything. And what I understood sitting there was that I had run out of the thing that makes administrative work possible. The thing that tells you your work connects to outcomes, that what you file and flag and recommend and circulate has a relationship to what happens. 19 years in the Outer Approaches Bureau had been built on that connection. Every petition I had processed, every flag I had logged, every recommendation I had written had been built on the premise that the correspondence chain was a chain, that what moved through it produced results, that the results were connected to the inputs. The Vathari continuance had had its correspondence chain. It had had its working groups, and its directorates, and its senior analysts, and its navigation congresses. It had had the conditions document and the time-stamped anomalies and the 7 minutes of the navigation officer's recording. It had had my colleague's recommendation and my recommendation and our joint presentation to the 12 members of the Congress, and the Congress had taken it under advisement and filed a third petition. I took my personal files, and I left the building, and I did not go back. The third petition's acknowledgement arrived. I was told later, 6 days after submission. The timestamp on the acknowledgement was 22 days before the petition was sent. The transit conditions were received 30 days after the acknowledgement. I have not read them. I was told only that they were longer than the first conditions document, and that the passage and return section occupied more pages. I do not know what the processing sentence said in the third conditions document, whether it used the same language or different language, because the directorate sealed the document under a higher designation tier than the first one, and I no longer had access to the archive. The Vathari Navigation Congress voted to proceed. I am going to tell you what happened to the third convoy in the plainest language I have, cause this is what the Assembly needs to hear. And because I have spent a very long time deciding how to say it, and I have concluded that plainness, the only form of respect the situation admits. The third convoy was 9 vessels. They departed in sequence over a 14-hour window. The Convoy Staging Authority confirmed departure for all 9 vessels and logged each departure in the standard format. The convoy entered the approach corridor to Orath Vayan on schedule. The convoy's final communication to the Staging Authority was a routine departure formation, the kind of message that says we are entering the approach. All systems nominal, next contact on the far boundary schedule. The Staging Authority logged the message and set a timer for the expected far boundary contact window. The far boundary contact window opened. No contact was received. The Staging Authority waited through the full contact window, then through the standard extended window, then through the post-extended waiting period that applies when extended windows are missed. No contact was received. The Staging Authority flagged the convoy as overdue and initiated the standard overdue protocol, involved transmitting a recall signal on the convoy's emergency frequency. No response was received to the recall signal. The Staging Authority flagged the convoy as missing and escalated to the Outer Affairs Directorate. The Directorate transmitted a communication to the Orath Vayan contact frequency, using the specified signal format, inquiring about the status of the convoy. The Directorate received an acknowledgement. The acknowledgement contained 2 elements. First element was a reference number. The reference number, when cross-referenced in the outer registry, returned a single result, the Vathari Navigation Congress's third petition, under its filing number, with a status notation that read, processed. The second element was a timestamp. The timestamp on the acknowledgement was dated 4 years before the third petition was filed, 4 years before the convoy was assembled, 4 years before the Navigation Congress voted to proceed, 4 years before the conditions document was received, 4 years before the second petition's withdrawal notification was sent. It was dated to a period before either of the first 2 petitions existed, to a time when the Vathari's Outer Approach Bureau was processing routine filings, and I was a third-tier analyst who had never heard of Orath Vayan and a Navigation Congress. Somewhere in the continuance's administrative structure was beginning, for reasons I cannot reconstruct, to find the Hezeth corridor congestion numbers interesting. The Directorate did not send a follow-up communication. The Vathari Navigation Congress did not convene again. The Outer Affairs Directorate issued a formal closure notice for all Orath Vayan approach files and submitted a request to the Galactic Outer Registry update the Orath Vayan designation with a non-approach notation at the highest available tier. The designation record was updated. The Bureau began the process of decommissioning its Outer Approaches Division, which took 3 years and which, as far as I was able to learn, was completed without incident. The Vethari continuance persisted for another 11 years as an administrative and cultural body, diminished, quieter than it had been, until the internal pressures that follow the loss of something a civilization was organized around made further continuance impractical, and the continuance dissolved in an orderly and mostly unremarkable fashion, and the species that had composed it merged into other administrative structures, or resettled or simply became, in the galactic record, a historical notation. I want to say this next part carefully, because it is the part that the Assembly needs to understand, and because I have not said it aloud to anyone before. The 4-year predated timestamp is not, I believe, a mechanical anomaly. It is not a clock error or a signal artifact or a database glitch. I have thought about it for many years, and my conclusion is that it is a description of when the third petition was actually processed. Not when it was submitted, not when the acknowledgement was sent, when it was processed. When whatever administers Orithvan received, reviewed, evaluated, and issued a determination on the petition. That determination was issued 4 years before the petition existed in the Vethari's records, which means that the petition's outcome, the convoy's outcome, was settled 4 years before the convoy departed, 4 years before the conditions document was received, 4 years before the Congress voted to proceed. The Navigation Congress believed it was making a decision. It was not making a decision. The decision had already been made, by something that does not wait for decisions to be submitted before processing them. The Congress believed it was sending a convoy into a corridor that would evaluate the convoy's compliance and respond accordingly. It was not sending a convoy into an evaluation. It was sending a convoy into an outcome that had already been determined, processed. The Orvith Assembly is considering submitting a formal transit petition for the Sorvith Passage is Approach Corridor 7 of the Orith-Vayan boundary. I am 63 years into my profession, which is no longer in the Outer Approaches Bureau, because the Bureau no longer exists. I have spent 42 of those years thinking about the timestamp on the first acknowledgement, which was 11 days before the petition, about the timestamp on the second acknowledgement, which was 18 days before the petition, about the timestamp on the third acknowledgement, which was 4 years before the petition. I have thought about what the interval between those timestamps means. 11 days, 18 days, 4 years. The gap's not random. It is not noise in the system. The gap grows. The gap grows in a way that correlates with the escalating seriousness of the approach. First a cautious bureaucratic inquiry, then a commercial transit authority filing, then a navigation Congress decision. The zone processed each of these further in advance of their submission than the last, which means the zone's processing of a petition is not a response to the petition. It is a prior determination, speed, made a depth of advance that corresponds to the weight of the intention behind the petition. The Orvith Assembly is not a commercial transit authority. It is a governing body. The weight of its intention, in the zone's processing framework, is not comparable to the Vethari's second petition. It is not comparable to the Vethari's third petition. I do not know how far in advance the zone has already processed an Orvith Assembly petition. I do not know whether the processing is already complete. I do not know what the outcome is. I know that the Vethari navigation officer described the corridor as attended. I know that he described the attending presence as one that produces not fear but certainty, because fear is uncertainty, and what the corridor produces is not uncertainty. I know that 3 members of his crew never returned to active duty of any kind. I know that the Vethari continuance is a historical notation in a registry that still carries an active designation for Orith-Vayan at the highest non-approach tier available. I know that whatever is in that corridor has already read this deposition. I know this because the deposition is, in functional terms, a communication addressed to the same question as the petitions. It is a document about Orith-Vayan, used by a party with knowledge of the approach history, circulated within a body that is considering an approach. If the zone's processing framework includes communications of this nature, and I have no reason to believe it excludes them, then it has already processed this document. It knew what I was going to say before I said it. I am not saying this to frighten you. I am saying it because It is the accurate description of the thing you are considering approaching. It is a thing that processes petitions before they exist. It is a thing that returned one vessel intact from 31 hours of transit in a corridor described by the vessel's commanding officer as attended by a certainty that makes fear beside the point. It is a thing that processed 9 vessels and issued a status notation that read, "Processed," with a timestamp that settled the matter 4 years before the matter was submitted. I want to describe one more thing, and then I am done. In the years after I left the Bureau, I occasionally requested access to the Outer Registry's public navigation notices for the Orith-Vayan boundary region. Not to the sealed files, I no longer had access to those, and I did not request it, but to the public designation record, which is available to any registered researcher, and which is updated by the registry when zone designations change. I did this approximately once every 3 years, as a matter of personal habit. The designation record for Orith-Vayan did not change. The non-approach notation at the highest available tier remained in place. The status field continued to read what it had read when the Directorate added the closure notation. I found, over the years, checking it regularly had the same function as any ritual a person develops to manage something they cannot resolve. It told me that the record was still there, that the archive still held what it held, that whatever the zone was doing, it was doing it in the same way it had always done it, and that the notation the Directorate had placed was still standing. 2. The last time I checked the public designation record, 2 months before the Orvith Assembly's transit proposal reached me, the status field had one addition. A single line appended below the Vethari closure notation in the registry's standard entry format, timestamp in the timestamp field. The line read, "Inquiry noted." I do not know when that line was added, because the timestamp in the timestamp field predates the establishment of the Outer Registry's current formatting system by a period that the registry's own technical documentation describes as an archival anomaly. A timestamp that sits outside the range the system was designed to accommodate, which the registry's automated processes have logged as unresolved, and which no one at the registry has been able to explain. I do not know what inquiry the line refers to. I do not know whether it refers to the Vethari petitions, or to the general category of inquiry that the zone has been receiving for longer than any current registry system has been running. I know that the line was not in the designation record the previous time I checked, 3 years prior. I know that the Orvith Assembly's transit proposal had been under internal discussion for approximately 14 months before it reached me. 14 months is inside the range of advanced processing that the Vethari petition record suggests is normal for a proposal of this institutional weight. I know that whatever is in that corridor has already read this deposition. Do not file transit petition for the Sorvith passage. Find another route. Add 42 days. Add 84 days. Add whatever is necessary to use a route that does not require you to submit a document to something that will read it before you write it, and issue its determination before you receive it, and mark the outcome in its own record at a time that corresponds not to when you acted, but to how seriously you intended to act. I have given this deposition once. I will not give it again. I ask that the record be sealed with the petition files in the Vethari archive, under the designation that the Vethari Outer Affairs Directorate applied before the continuance dissolved, which I am told still exists in the Outer Registry under its original filing number, unchanged, because no one has submitted a request to alter it, and the zone has not submitted a request to alter it, and the registry simply carries it, as it carries all of its entries, in the patient institutional silence that archives share with everything that endures. The session is concluded. I have nothing more to add.